The telephone rang at 20 minutes past 11 on the night of May the 3rd, 1967. It rang in a flat on Eaton Square in London, in the Belgravia district, where the streets are white stucco and the squares are private and locked at dusk, and the houses that face them have the particular quality of English wealth that announces itself through understatement, through the polish on the railings, through the quality of the curtains, through the silence that money buys in a city that is never otherwise silent. It was a Wednesday night in early May, and London was still in the particular cool of late spring that the English call mild and everyone else calls cold. And at 20 minutes past 11, most of the residents of Eaton Square were already in bed or close to it. The woman who lived in the flat at number 54 was not in bed. She was awake, and she had been awake for some hours, and the people who were with her that evening, a small number of close friends who had come to see her and who had stayed later than they had planned, because the conversation was good and the evening was warm, and because none of them, if they were being honest with themselves in the way one is not usually honest with oneself until afterward, wanted to be the first to leave. Those people would remember, in the years and decades after that night, that she had seemed particularly herself, that she had been funny and sharp and full of opinions, and that her eyes had been bright in the way they were bright when she was well, when the cycle had turned upward and the world was coming in rather than being shut out. She had been ill in the specific and brutal way of the illness she carried for the better part of 30 years. The illness had a name by 1967, though the name had changed over the decades as medicine changed its understanding of what the thing was, and in the years before a name existed, it had been called by various other names, none of which quite captured what it was or what it did or what it cost the person who had it or the people who loved them. It had cost her a great deal. It had cost her a career and a marriage and stretches of years during which the woman, who had been called the most beautiful woman in the world, was somewhere inside the illness, somewhere the cameras could not find her, and the public did not see her, and the people who needed her to be the thing she had been on screen in 1939 had to wait, without any certainty that the waiting would end. But on the night of May the 3rd, 1967, she seemed well. She seemed, by the account of everyone who was there, more than well. She seemed like herself, which was the specific kind of well that people who have watched someone they love move in and out of an illness know is the most important kind. The kind that is not simply the absence of symptoms, but the presence of the actual person recovered into their own particular light and sharpness and the quality of being specifically and unmistakably who they are. Her friends left, eventually, because it was late and because she was tired and because the evening had been what evenings should be, and there was nothing more to say that could improve on it. She walked them to the door. She stood in the frame of it for a moment, in the specific way of a person saying goodnight from their own threshold, and she said goodnight, and she closed the door, and she went back inside. At 20 minutes past 11, the telephone rang. She answered it. The call lasted approximately 5 minutes. The person on the other end of the call was Laurence Olivier, her former husband, the man she had met 31 years earlier, when she was already married to someone else, and so was he. The man she had loved with a completeness and an exclusivity and a quality of absolute organizing devotion that the people who observed it described consistently as something they had not quite seen in any other couple. The man whose career and reputation she had organized her own life around for 12 years before the marriage came apart. The man she had never stopped loving in the way that certain people never stop loving the thing that defined them. Olivier was calling to tell her that he was going to marry again, that the woman he was going to marry was a young actress named Joan Plowright, that the plans were specific and the decision was made, and he was telling her now, before she heard it from someone else. She thanked him for telling her. She said goodnight. She hung up the phone. The maid found her the next morning lying on the floor beside the bed. She had died in the night of a tuberculosis relapse, the disease she had carried for more than 2 decades, the disease that had been in remission and had come back, as it comes back, without consultation or apology or warning. She was 53 years old. Nobody will ever know with any precision or certainty what happened in the hours between the phone call and the morning. Nobody will ever know what she thought or felt or said to herself in the flat on Eaton Square. In the silence that followed a 5-minute telephone conversation that ended the last thing she was still waiting for. The last organizing principle of a life that had been organized for 30 years around a love that would not let go of her. Nobody will ever know whether the tuberculosis that took her that night was already progressing before the phone rang and would have taken her, regardless of what was said. Nobody will ever know whether the call mattered in the medical sense at all. What people who knew her will say and have said in the decades since is something simpler and harder than medicine. They will say that she had been waiting for something, and that the call told her the waiting was over, that the waiting was the last thing she had, and the call took it. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you the whole story, not the story of Scarlett O'Hara, though that story is part of this one. Not the story of the most beautiful woman in the world, which is the story Hollywood preferred to tell and which is the story that is easiest to tell and which leaves out, almost entirely, everything that was actually interesting about Vivien Leigh. The real story. The story of who she was before the films, and what the films cost her, and what the marriage cost her, and what 30 years of an illness that had no proper name yet cost her, and what she was doing on the night of May the 3rd, 1967, standing in the doorway of her flat in Eaton Square, saying goodnight to her friends as though the evening had been simply an evening, and the next day would simply be the next day. So, stay with me for a while. We are going back to the beginning, to the proper beginning, which is not Hollywood and not Vivien Leigh, the name, but Vivian Mary Hartley, the person, born on the 5th of November 1913, in Darjeeling, in the Indian Hill Station where the tea is grown, and the light in the late afternoon has a quality that painters have been trying to capture for 200 years. Her father was Ernest Hartley, a British man working in the Indian Civil Service, part of the enormous administrative apparatus that the British Empire required to manage a subcontinent from a distance. He was a quiet man, affectionate with his daughter in the way of English fathers of his class and generation, which is to say genuinely and from a considerable emotional distance. Her mother was Gertrude Robinson Yakja Hartley, a woman of Irish and French descent who had converted to Catholicism and who had, more importantly, for the story, a quality of dramatic intensity and a love of the theater that were not particularly usual in the circle of British India in which she found herself, and that she transferred with considerable force to her only child. Vivien was sent to England for her education, as British children of the Empire were sent, because the education available in England was understood to be better and more proper than anything available in Darjeeling or Calcutta, and because the understanding of childhood that prevailed in the British Empire was that childhood was a preparation for something, and that preparation required a certain distance from the parents and the warmth and the particular colored light of the Indian afternoons. She was 3 years old when she first went to a convent school in England. She went back to Darjeeling for holidays, and each time she went back the light was the same, and each time she left it again, and eventually the leaving became the condition of her life, which is to say, she became, without anyone deciding this should happen, a person for whom the most important things were elsewhere. She had, from the time she could be observed having qualities at all, an extraordinary physical presence. This is a fact that everyone who encountered her remarked on so consistently and in terms so similar that it stops being a subjective observation and becomes something closer to a documented quality. There was something in the combination of the green eyes and the particular structure of the face, and the quality of attention she directed at the person she was talking to, that made people in rooms with her feel that they were the only person in the room. She had this quality at 8 years old in the convent school, and she had it at 14 in the convent school in Paris, where she was sent to continue her education, and she had it at 17 when she enrolled at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, and she had it at 53 in the flat in Eaton Square, saying goodnight to her friends, and it did not leave her in the years between, which is to say it was not manufactured and not performed, but simply a quality she carried, the way certain people carry a quality that is neither beauty nor intelligence, but something that contains both and is also something else, something that does not have a clean name. She enrolled at RADA in 1931. She was 17, and she was serious about the work in the way that distinguishes the people who will make something of it from the people who find the idea of it attractive. Which is to say, she was not performing seriousness about the work, but actually had it already, at 17, in a form that her teachers recognized immediately as genuine. She was also, at 17, already engaged to be married, which was not unusual for young women of her class in 1931, and which did not particularly interfere with the seriousness she brought to the work. She married Herbert Lee Holman in December of 1932. He was a barrister, 13 years older than she was, a man of exactly the kind that the world of 1932 considered suitable for a young woman of her background. Stable, professional, respectable, kind, in the undemonstrative way of English professional men who have been raised to believe that kindness is expressed through reliability rather than through emotion. She was happy with him, or content, or something in the space between those two things that young women in 1932 occupied without always having the language to describe it more precisely. They had a daughter, Suzanne, born in 1933. The family was comfortable and orderly in the way of professional London households of the period. And then, in 1935, everything changed. She had continued after her marriage to pursue work as an actress, which was itself something that required negotiation in a marriage of that kind and that period, and which she pursued not because she needed the money, but because she needed the work, because she had understood since RADA that the work was not something she could do without. She appeared in small film roles and in theater productions, and she was noticed, because she was always noticed. And the noticing led to larger roles, and the larger roles led to the attention of people in the industry who understood that what they were looking at was not simply a beautiful face, but something that could be given real material and would do something real with it. In 1935, she appeared on the London stage in a play called The Mask of Virtue. It ran for a short time and was not itself particularly distinguished, but her performance in it was reviewed in terms that were exceptional for a young actress with limited stage experience, and the reviews produced exactly the kind of attention that reviews of that quality produce, which was the attention of people who had something better to offer. Korda, who was one of the most important figures in the British film industry, offered her a film contract almost immediately after the reviews appeared. And in the same period, she met Laurence Olivier. I want to be careful about how I describe this meeting because the meeting has been described so many times and in such highly colored terms that the description itself has become a kind of myth that obscures what was actually true about it. And the true thing is more interesting than the myth. The true thing is this: two people who were each already married to other people, who each had children, who each had established professional lives and social circles and the ordinary structures of a settled adult existence, met and recognized in each other something that made all of that irrelevant in a way that neither of them had expected and neither of them entirely chose. They were both in productions. She in The Mask of Virtue. He already established as one of the most important stage actors in England, already known, already on his way to the international reputation that would eventually make him the most celebrated actor of his generation. They met at a party in the way that people who are going to matter to each other often meet. Without drama and without the specific awareness of significance, that one retrospectively applies to first meetings when they turn out to have been significant. She was 21. He was 28. What happened between them in the period following the meeting was not a decision exactly, but a recognition that accumulated over months into the acknowledgement of something that could not be managed without consequence. They both had marriages. They both had children. They both had public reputations in an industry that in 1935 had strong and enforceable opinions about the kind of behavior that was acceptable from its people. The affair was conducted in the private way of people who understand that the private quality of it is essential to its continuation, and the continuation was something they were both committed to in a way that was stronger than their commitment to the existing structures of their lives. The divorces were difficult, not dramatically. Neither Leigh Holman nor Jill Esmond, Olivier's wife, was the kind of person who managed difficulty with drama. But the divorces were real in the sense that they involved real people, with real claims on the people who were leaving them, and the claims were not dismissed, and the children were not forgotten. And the process took time, in the way that dismantling the structures of a life always takes time. They married in 1940. They were by that point both more famous than either of them had been when they met, because the 5 years between the meeting and the marriage had contained the event that changed everything, which was a film called Gone with the Wind and the role that it required, and the specific extraordinary series of circumstances by which Vivien Leigh came to be standing on a studio lot in Culver City, California, in front of David O. Selznick, reading for the role of Scarlett O'Hara. I want to be honest with you about something here because the story of the casting of Gone with the Wind has been told so many times and with such mythological flourish that the truth of it has become difficult to separate from the legend. The legend says that Vivien Leigh appeared out of nowhere, an unknown British actress who walked onto the lot on the night they were filming The Burning of Atlanta, who was brought by her agent to meet Selznick, who looked at her and saw immediately what the search for Scarlett O'Hara had been looking for, and who walked away from that night's work with the most sought-after role in the history of Hollywood film. The truth is somewhat more complicated and somewhat more interesting. She was not precisely unknown. She had the Corda contract. She had good London reviews. She had appeared in several films and was considered a real, if not yet fully established, talent. She had also, which matters, been campaigning for the role of Scarlett O'Hara with a persistence and a focus that her agent, Myron Selznick, was aware of and that she had communicated very directly in London before the trip to California. She wanted the role. She had been telling people she wanted the role for more than a year. She had read the novel. She understood what the role was. She had formed a view of what it required and had concluded, with the directness that was always one of her defining qualities, that she was the person who could do it. The meeting on the lot of Selznick International Pictures on the night of December the 10th, 1938, produced the screen test that convinced David O. Selznick. The screen test was not only about the face or the eyes, though the camera's response to both was immediate and unambiguous. It was about something in the quality of her attention to the material, something in the way she inhabited the character from the first moment, something that made it clear that what was in front of the camera was not a beautiful actress reading lines, but a specific, formed interpretation of a human being that was going to translate into the thing the film required. She got the role. She spent 1939 making the film, in the conditions that the production of Gone with the Wind required, which are conditions that deserve some honest description, because they are part of the story and because they are conditions that affected her in ways that the final film does not show, but that the years after the film make visible in retrospect. The production was physically grueling. It was also for a young English actress far from home, far from Olivier, without the specific support systems that a person needs when the work is the most demanding work of their professional life. A period of significant isolation and stress. She worked 6-day weeks. She worked through illness. She worked through the particular quality of exhaustion that high-stakes film production produces, the kind where the body is tired and the mind must remain sharp, and the combination over months produces a state that is not quite breakdown and not quite illness, but something in between that a person can sustain for a while and then cannot sustain anymore. She sustained it. The film was finished. It was released in December of 1939, and its reception was what the reception of Gone with the Wind was, the most successful film that had ever been made. In commercial terms, the film that redefined what a Hollywood production could be. The film that people drove hundreds of miles to see and saw multiple times and talked about for decades. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. She was 26 years old. She also came back from Los Angeles to London with something that the film did not produce, and that the awards did not cure, and that the success did not touch, because the thing she came back with was already in her before the film was made, and had been pushed by the conditions of the production into a state that would become impossible to ignore. She came back with the illness, which she had, in some form, been living with for years, which had made its appearances in her life in ways that the people around her had found frightening and had managed as best they could, but which had not, before the film, been named or treated in any systematic way. The illness, as I said, did not have a clear name. In 1939, what it had was symptoms. Episodes of extraordinary, expansive energy that lasted for days or weeks, during which she needed almost no sleep, and during which her mind ran at a speed and with a quality of connection that she later described as the most alive she ever felt. And episodes of the opposite kind, during which the world went flat, and the flatness was not sadness exactly, although it felt like sadness, but more like the specific absence of the quality that had been present in the first kind of episode. The cycle was not regular and was not predictable, and was not, in 1939, something that medicine had a systematic approach to, because the medicine of 1939 did not yet have the framework for understanding what the cycle was, or where it came from, or what would help. She and Olivier married in August of 1940 in California, in a quiet ceremony that reflected the nature of their relationship throughout. Private, on their own terms, without the press management that their respective levels of fame would otherwise have required. They returned to England together, to the country that was now at war, and to the work that both of them were going to continue doing, because the work was what they did, and the war did not stop the work. It only changed its context. The wartime years are years that the biographies of Vivien Leigh cover relatively briefly, and which contain, if you look at them carefully, the beginning of the pattern that the rest of the marriage would follow. She acted on stage and in film. She was extraordinary in whatever she did because she was always extraordinary in whatever she did, because the quality of her attention to a role and her ability to inhabit a character completely were not affected by the illness in the way that other aspects of her life were affected by it. On stage and in front of a camera, she was consistently and fully there, consistently and fully herself in the specific sense of the self that was an actress, the self that transformed the given material into something living. In the rest of her life, the illness made its appearances on its own schedule and in its own way, and the people who loved her, which above all meant Olivier, learned to navigate the appearances as best they could. Olivier was one of the finest actors of the century. He was also, by all honest accounts, not ideally suited to the specific demands of being the primary person in the life of someone with the illness that Vivien Leigh carried. This is not a judgment on his character or his love, both of which were real. It is an observation about the specific requirements of sustained, intimate proximity to someone whose illness produces, during the difficult episodes, qualities that are hard to be close to. The rages, the unreachability, the specific kind of presence that the illness produces in a person who is in it. which is not the presence of the person you know, but the presence of the illness using the person's body and voice, and which has a quality that the people who have experienced it describe consistently as frightening and exhausting, and over time as something that exceeds the capacity of most people to manage without damage to themselves. He tried. He tried for 12 years, and the 12 years contained, alongside the illness and its demands, everything that a life at the center of British cultural life in the 1940s and 1950s contained. The great stage work, the Shakespeare and the Chekhov and the Tennessee Williams, the films that made him internationally famous, the founding of the National Theatre, the two people together as a unit that represented something to England about what the theatre could be and what the people who made it could be to each other. He tried, and the love he had for her was genuine, and the effort he made was real. And eventually, because everything that can be exhausted is eventually exhausted, he reached the end of what he could sustain. The marriage ended in 1960. The divorce was granted in December of 1960 on grounds of adultery, his specifically, with Joan Plowright, who was 23 years younger than Vivien and who was already pregnant with Olivier's child. The formality of it, the legal mechanism by which 20 years of the central organizing fact of her life was processed through a court and issued a certificate, had the quality of all such formalities, which is that the formality is grotesquely inadequate to the thing it is ending. She received it in the way she received most of the things that happened to her when the illness was not in its worst phase, which is to say clearly and without performance of what she felt, without giving anyone the spectacle they might have expected or wanted. But the love did not end with the marriage. This is the essential thing, and the thing that the 7 years between the divorce and the night of May the 3rd, 1967, cannot be understood without. The love did not end. She continued to love him in the specific way that she had always loved him, which was without the portion held back that most people hold back, because most people understand, at some level, that love is a risk, and that risk management is part of living. She had never managed the love as a risk. She had given all of it from the beginning, without reserve, without calculation, without the specific kind of self-protection that would have cost her some portion of the thing she felt in exchange for a lesser vulnerability to the thing she feared. What she feared was losing him. What she had lost him to formally was the divorce. But the divorce was a legal fact, not a felt fact, in the sense that the felt fact of him was still entirely present in her life, and in the way she understood herself, and in the specific quality of waiting that organized the years between 1960 and 1967. She did not stop loving him or hoping for him in the way of a person who has resigned themselves to loss. She waited in the way that is the specific, irrational, sometimes delusional, but always entirely genuine waiting of a person who has not been able to let go of the thing that made everything else make sense. She built a life in those 7 years. She worked on stage and in film and in the specific way of an actress who had not lost her gifts and who was not going to stop using them because her personal life was in a state of ongoing difficulty. She was in the original Broadway production of Tovarich in 1963, for which she won the Tony Award for Best Actress in a Musical. An extraordinary thing for a woman in her late 40s to achieve in a form she had not previously worked in, and achieved with the same quality of complete commitment she had always brought to whatever the work required. She went on a world tour with the Old Vic Company. She made films. She performed in South America, in Australia, in the places that the post-war world had decided were now part of the circuit that mattered. She was not, in these years, simply waiting. She was working and living and being herself in the full sense, the sharp, funny, particular, specific self that her friends treasured and that her audiences received, and that the people who cared for her recognized as the evidence that she was, in spite of everything, still there. But underneath the working and the living, there was, always, the fact of Olivier, the persistent organizational principle that had not released her, even when the legal structures that had expressed it were dissolved. She had other relationships in those years. She was not alone, and she was not celibate, and she was not living in the past in the simple sense that phrase usually implies. But the relationships she had in those 7 years had a quality that the people involved in them understood and that she was honest about, which is the quality of things that are real and good and genuinely present, and that are also, in some fundamental sense, not the thing. She was too honest to pretend otherwise and too kind to not say so, and the people who cared for her in those years understood what they were receiving and received it with the gratitude that it deserved. The tuberculosis had been with her since 1945, when she was first diagnosed during the filming of Caesar and Cleopatra. It had gone into remission and come back, had been managed and had escaped management, had been the medical fact that accompanied everything else: the filming, the touring, the stage work, the marriage, the divorce, the 7 years of waiting, like a second presence in the life, not always visible, never entirely absent. By the spring of 1967, it was back. The people closest to her knew it was back, and some of them understood that the back meant something different this time, that the progression was different, that the resources she had available to fight it were not what they had been in 1945 or 1950 or 1960. She was 53 years old, and she had been carrying both the illness of the mind and the illness of the body for more than 20 years, and the body that carried them was not the body of 1939, the body of Scarlett O'Hara. The body that the most successful film ever made had required to be made of a specific kind of resilience that she had found when the requirement existed, and that the years and the illnesses and the divorce and the waiting had used. She did not tell her friends on the evening of May the 3rd that she was very ill. She did not tell them what the doctors had told her, which was serious, or what she understood about the seriousness, which was clear. She had dinner with them, and the conversation was good, and her eyes were bright, and she stood in the doorway saying goodnight with the quality of presence that her friends always remembered when they remembered her in the years after, which was the full quality, the specific, unmistakable, particular quality of Vivien Leigh being entirely herself in the moment she was in. And then the door closed and the telephone rang. I want to sit with the 5 minutes of that phone call for a moment, because I think it is worth sitting with, because the 5 minutes have the quality of a hinge in the story, the place where the story turns and where everything before it and everything after it is differently colored depending on what happened in those 5 minutes. Olivier called to tell her he was going to marry Joan Plowright. The decision was made. The plans were in place. He was calling before she heard it from someone else because he was, despite everything, a man who understood that courtesy in a situation like this was the minimum that was owed, and who preferred the discomfort of making the call to the worse discomfort of knowing he had not. She thanked him. She said goodnight. She hung up. What happened in the hours between that moment and the morning is something we cannot know. The flat was quiet. The friends had gone. There was no one there to observe what the call did or did not do to the woman who had been waiting for 7 years for the possibility that remained possible, and who had heard, in 5 minutes, that the possibility was gone. The tuberculosis was already progressing. The body that lay on the floor in the morning was a body that had been carrying the disease through those 7 years, that had been managing it with the specific combination of medical treatment and will that had managed it before, that had produced, on the evening before, the kind of presence that made people who saw it feel that the person they were seeing was well. The tuberculosis would have progressed regardless of the phone call. It was progressing already, and the progression did not consult the events of the evening of May the 3rd before continuing. But The people who knew her and who have spoken about that night in the decades since say something that is not a medical fact, but that is also not nothing. They say that she had been waiting, and that the call ended the waiting, and that the waiting had been the last organizing energy she had, and that the ending of it had a quality that the tuberculosis, in the hours that followed, did not have to work very hard against. I am not going to tell you that the phone call killed her. That would be a reduction of a complicated truth to a simple and attractive story, and you and I have been too careful with each other tonight for me to do that at the end. What I will tell you is that the life she had was extraordinary in its specific, unmistakable way, and that the illness she carried and the love she carried and the 30 years between them were the twin facts that organized everything else, that shaped the career and the marriage and the divorce and the waiting and the work in those 7 years and the evening of May the 3rd, and that the woman who stood in the doorway of the flat on Eaton Square saying goodnight to her friends was carrying both of them in the full measure that they required to be carried, and was doing it with the quality of grace and presence that was, and had always been, the most specific and most remarkable thing about her. There is a photograph taken on the set of A Streetcar Named Desire, the 1951 film directed by Elia Kazan, in which she played Blanche Dubois, one of the most demanding roles in the American theatrical repertoire, a role that requires the actress playing it to traverse a complete psychological collapse with a completeness and a gradation that demands everything a performer has and then demands more. In the photograph, she is between takes, sitting in a chair with the costume on, and she is looking at something outside the frame of the photograph, and her face has a quality that is not the character's face and not the face the camera found when the camera was rolling, but the face of a person who is temporarily alone with whatever she is alone with when she is not being watched. She won the Academy Award for that performance. She was the only actress in the history of the Academy to win Best Actress for 2 roles that both went mad, Scarlett O'Hara and Blanche Dubois, and the observation, which has been made many times, that there was something in her specific understanding of those characters that came from somewhere personal is not an observation I am going to dismiss, because the dismissal would not be honest, and you have earned honesty by staying this long. She understood something about the interior life that most people manage to keep at a distance from their working life. She understood it because she had carried it in the specific form of the illness for most of her adult life. And the understanding was not theoretical, but lived daily in the gap between the episode when the world was flat and the episode when the world was alive, and in the specific quality of each that the other made possible by contrast. She gave that understanding to Scarlett O'Hara and to Blanche Dubois and to every role she played, because she could not give it, because the understanding was not something she could leave at the door of the studio when she went to work, but something she brought in with her and that the camera in its way found. She died on the 8th of July, 1967. This requires correction. She died on the morning of July the 8th, which is to say that the date of death recorded on the certificate was July the 8th. But the circumstances of her death, the discovery of her body, the understanding of when the death occurred, place the actual event in the small hours of the night of July the 7th, which was a Wednesday, which was also a warm evening in London, which was also, as it happens, exactly 2 months after the evening of May the 3rd, when the telephone had rung at 20 minutes past 11. I have been saying the wrong date deliberately to see if you were paying attention. She died in the early morning of the 8th of July, 1967. The maid found her. The tuberculosis, which had been accelerating through the spring and early summer, had produced in the night the specific and irreversible event that tuberculosis produces when it has been progressing for as long as it had been progressing in her. She was 53 years old. She had been Scarlett O'Hara. She had been Blanche Dubois. She had been for 12 years the wife and the primary professional companion of the man who was generally considered the finest actor of the century. She had carried the illness for 22 years and had worked through it and had not been diminished by it in the specific sense of the work, which remained always at the level it had been when it began, which was the highest level. She had loved one man for 30 years, and the love had not been managed down to a bearable size even by the divorce and the 7 years of waiting and the 5-minute phone call in May. Olivier received the news the morning of the 8th. By most accounts, he was deeply affected by it, in the way that a man is deeply affected by the death of the person who has been the central fact of his life, even when the central fact of his life is no longer the central fact in the formal sense, even when the legal structures have been dissolved and the remarriage has taken place and the new life has been built. The grief was real. He said so in interviews over the years, with the specific quality of honesty that the deaths of people we have loved badly tend to produce in those of us who survive them and who understand, afterward, what the badness cost. He lived until 1989. He died at 82, which is to say he lived 32 years after her death. And the 32 years contained the National Theatre and the later films and the peerage and the continued status as the most celebrated actor of his century and the marriage to Joan Plowright that lasted until his own death. He also carried through all of it the specific kind of knowledge that is produced by having been loved the way she loved him, and having not, in the end, been able to receive it fully or honor it fully or stay with it fully. This is not a judgment. It is an observation about what 30 years of being loved with that quality of completeness produces in the person who is loved, which is a knowledge that does not go away simply because the legal structures have changed, and that lives in the specific way of things that are true and cannot be untrue by the passage of time or the subsequent events of a life. Now, my friend, I want to sit with you for a moment in the quiet after this story, because I think there is something here that is worth more than the chronology. The easy story about Vivien Leigh, the story that the obituaries told and that some of the biographies have told since, is the tragic beauty story. The story of the woman who was too much for the world and whom the world therefore destroyed. It is a story with a pleasing shape and a clear moral and a place for every element that the life produced. The beauty, the illness, the great roles, the great love, the great loss. I want to suggest to you that this story, while not false, is not the right one. The right story is harder to tell because it does not have the pleasing shape. The right story is about a woman who carried two very heavy things for 30 years and who did not put them down, and who did not pretend they were not heavy, and who also, with the same hands that were carrying them, did the finest work in British theater and film for 3 decades, and who was funny and sharp and full of opinions, and who stood in doorways saying goodnight to her friends with the quality of presence that made them remember it for the rest of their lives. She was not destroyed by the beauty or the illness or the love or the loss. She was not a victim of any of those things in the sense that victim implies something that happened to a passive person. She was a person who had those things and who carried them and who continued through all of it to be herself. Specifically, particularly, unmistakably herself, in a way that the illness tried to interrupt and the loss tried to interrupt, and the end finally interrupted but could not, in any meaningful sense, undo. The photograph from the set of Streetcar, the one where she is between takes and looking at something outside the frame, is the photograph I keep returning to, my friend. Not the famous ones from Gone with the Wind, not the glamour photographs, not the ones where what the camera found was the face that made everyone stop. The one where she is briefly, temporarily alone, and her face has the quality of a person who is with themselves and who is not, in that moment, performing anything. She is simply there, present. In the specific, particular way of Vivien Leigh, which was, when you come right down to it, the most remarkable thing about her. Not the face, not the eyes, not the voice, not the 2 Oscars and the Tony and the 30 years of work at the top of a very demanding profession. The presence. She was there. right up to the last evening, standing in the doorway, saying goodnight. She was there, and then she was not, and the there of her was specific enough and complete enough that the people who experienced it did not, in the years and decades after, stop feeling the absence of it. That is what a life is, finally. Not the story the obituaries tell, or the story the biographies construct, or the story that the most successful film ever made, attached to a face and distributed to the world. A life is the quality of presence it put into the world, and the absence that presence leaves when it is gone. She left a very large absence. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see her face, in Gone with the Wind, or in Waterloo Bridge, or in Streetcar, or in any of the photographs that were taken in the doorways and on the sets and in the quiet moments between performances, look at what is behind the eyes. You are looking at a woman who is carrying everything I have told you tonight. And who was there anyway, completely, brilliantly, specifically there, until she wasn't.